Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. Joe Biden warns Israel that it's losing support, but what role is he actually playing in the war in Gaza? Let's get to the bottom line. For months now, the U.S. has provided unwavering support for Israel as it pursues its war in Gaza and vetoed every attempt at a ceasefire. Now President Joe Biden says that Israel is losing support over its indiscriminate bombing of Gaza. More than 18,000 Palestinians have been killed by Israel since October 7th, mostly women and children, mostly crushed in apartment buildings, after a Hamas attack when 1,200 Israeli soldiers and civilians were killed. Israeli leaders still say they want to decimate the Islamic resistance movement, Hamas, retrieve 100-plus captives, and stay in Gaza indefinitely. But for Palestinians, it just seems like the point is to kill more of them, to starve the rest, and make the entire Gaza Strip unlivable. So 10 weeks into this war, with Biden warning Israeli leaders that they have tough decisions to make, what role is his administration actually playing? Today, I'm talking with political scientist Shibley Telhami, who teaches at the University of Maryland, and he's the author of The Stakes, America and the Middle East. Shibley, thank you so much for joining us. Let me just start out and ask you, how are America's stakes in the Middle East doing right now as it seems unable to affect Israel's course in this war?
Good to see you, Steve, and thanks for hosting me. Look, it doesn't look very good for American interest. I have always believed that from the first moment, after the Hamas attack, horrific Hamas attack on Israel, the president did well in showing empathy with the Israelis at the moment of vulnerability. Every president would have done that. But since then, he has taken decisions that were based on personal beliefs, personal preferences, personal emotions that were not necessarily driven by a considered assessment of American interests that are at stake. And there are huge American interests that are at stake. For one thing, when you're implicated in a war of this sort, meaning a war of this sort where almost every human rights organization calls, of course, called the Hamas attacks war crimes, but has called the Israeli actions in Gaza war crimes, and even worse, and some people are speculating about a possible genocide. When you have that kind of mass destruction and killing and death and ruin, and you're implicated in that in the sense that you're giving a blank check support, including your own weapons being delivered, even with emergency moves to bypass Congress to deliver that, you're implicated. You're implicated when you're vetoing a ceasefire at the UN. So you're seen to be part of the war. And I have always worried that this particular, the scale of destruction and devastation and horror is such that this is going to be imprinted on the consciousness of an entire generation, certainly in the Middle East of Arabs and Muslims, but really beyond, even young people beyond that. And that kind of results often in a blowback. And the blowback, of course, will be not just on Israel, but in this particular case on the U.S., which would be unfortunate and horrific, obviously, down the road potentially. So that's one. The second thing that I've worried about from day one is that the president's commitment, without, again, thinking about it or even having, remember, the president went to Israel. He even met with an Israeli war cabinet meeting. There is no evidence that the president has convened an interagency process to consider the implications of his decision, quote, to support the aim of destroying Hamas, whatever that means, vague as it is, even though most of us understood that such a decision on that scale was going to lead to devastation, destruction on the scale that we're witnessing, maybe destroying all of Gaza. And would we be prepared to pay the price, not just morally, but in terms of violation of international law? And would we be prepared for the possible escalation that will come out of it, meaning drawing parties like Hezbollah, drawing parties, now we see the Yemeni Houthis, drawing parties in Iraq, Syria, and potentially even drawing Iran in a way that engages the U.S. The president sent 2 carrier groups very quickly. I don't know that there was any interagency process to consider the consequences for escalation. So in that sense, the president seemed to allow his own personal preferences to drive decisions that have had grave consequences for America's national interest. And this is not over. It's not just about the possible blowback, which would be unfortunate, but it's also about the possible escalation, which I do not rule out at this point.
Shibley, you're saying something different. You said that Joe Biden shot from the hip, from his gut, and he did this personally. So my question is, this is a guy who was chair of the Council, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for years, was vice president, handled many foreign policy issues. Is he showing at this moment an incompetence in foreign policy that surprises you?
Well, I don't know about an incompetence, but certainly insensitivity or lack of deep understanding or I don't know if he has a blind spot on this issue. You and I have known him. I've known him when he was senator, and at various periods, particularly in the 1990s, I respected him as somebody who was thoughtful. And yes, he was a realist, but I had, considered him to be one of the people who are knowledgeable about foreign policy. I testified before one of his committees. I met with him when he was vice president to talk about this particular issue in a small group. And so I thought I knew him. Of course, he was pro-Israel, but honestly, every president of the United States is pro-Israel. And he, of course, was perhaps certainly more than Obama. We know that. I'm finishing up a book with a few colleagues about Obama and Trump and Biden presidencies. And we know that even in the Obama administration, he was taking more pro-Israel positions. But this shocked me. Yes, it shocked me because he's, number one, we all understood that he was a realist, but we also understood he was a compassionate realist, that he was a man who can convey empathy. Obviously, he conveyed a lot of empathy to the Israelis, and the Israelis reward him for it and understand him, including people who didn't like him or people who prefer Trump over him. But his inability to show even, the empathy for what was obviously horrific devastation in the Palestinians shocked me. Yes, I think it shocked me. That's number one. But his inability to separate his own personal feeling, to think that he knew exactly what he needed to do, and he was just going to bring everybody on board. And he was insensitive even to advice from within the State Department, within the White House that went to the contrary. He knew it all. We knew he had this kind of posture, which he thinks he knows better than the people he's discussing every issue with, but not on something that matters deeply to the interests of the United States. I think he miscalculated. He turned out to not have thought about this carefully, and now he's having to deal with the consequences.
Let me ask you about American leverage. Right now, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan is in Tel Aviv. I don't know what he's doing, but there's this sense that all of us are watching, helpless, what is now happening inside Palestine. And there seems to be no line that will trigger the involvement of at least others so far. What's going on here?
Well, first of all, remember, the President of the United States has not said we're going to stop support if you don't do X, Y, Z. The warning, quote the warning, and I use that in quotation markers. I'm not sure what that warning means. He says you're losing support of the rest of the international community over, quote, the indiscriminate attacks in Gaza. Hello, I mean, this is what been more than 2 months.
That's basically already happened. That's basically already happened.
Of course, it's happened. He's telling people the obvious, and people are rewarding him. Oh, this. He has, as long as, look, from Netanyahu's point of view and the far right minister in his government, or really the Israeli government broadly, they could care less about the General Assembly voting to call for a ceasefire, or the 13 members who voted in the Security Council in favor of a ceasefire. As long as the U.S. is going to employ the veto, as long as the weapon supplies will go unconditionally to Israel, as long as the funds from Congress will keep coming, they can live with the rest of it. It doesn't matter. They're protected, and there's nothing at all in the posture that Biden has taken, privately or publicly, that indicates that any of this is in jeopardy. And that his problem was from day one. saying that Israel has the right to defend itself. Of course it does. What state does not have the right to defend itself? Every state has the right to defend itself. But obviously, number one, even under normal circumstances, when there is such hardening of the hearts and devastation, destruction on your own side, when you demonize the other, you restrain anyway. But when you consider that he knew from day one, and he has even called the Israeli government the most extreme, that he has members of these Israeli governments want far more than self-defense. They want aims that were at odds with America's interests, that were at odds with American values, and you give them unrestrained free hand to do what they want with American weapons. That's irresponsible, in all honesty.
Shibley, I want to play a bit from a speech by the National Security Council spokesman, John Kirby, who spoke to Georgetown University students earlier this year.
This war could end today, right now, if Mr. Putin would just do the right thing and pull his troops out. Obviously, that doesn't appear to be anywhere near happening. He continues to fly Iranian drones and cruise missiles into civilian infrastructure, knocking out the heat, knocking out the power. I mean, are your families without heat or power? At least, yeah. Yeah, and hitting quite literally innocent civilian targets, playgrounds, schools, hospitals. It's utter depravity.
It is an eerie encapsulation of a different war, a different time, a different set of adversaries. But if you think about it, and I would just ask you this, because this is what Prime Minister Netanyahu and others have been saying to Hamas, is Hamas could end this by laying down its arms and leave. But my question is, what incentive would Hamas have to lay down its arms tomorrow?
Well, let's put this aside for a minute. I want to address particularly the clip itself about Ukraine. I think the president, for example, took the right decision to support Ukraine after the Russian invasion. I supported that. In fact, I woke up one morning, and you know me, I write more about the Middle East than Ukraine, although I follow that issue as well. I found myself on Putin's sanctioned list on that issue. But when the president asserted the support for Ukraine and galvanized European support and international support, it was in the name of defending a liberal international order,
right,
and a rules-based international order. Those are the two principles that he laid out as the core of his foreign policy, and obviously in addition to something that he came up with early, in fact, encountering Trump about human rights as a priority. And so, when you're looking at this and you're saying he just vetoed a resolution calling for a humanitarian ceasefire, it wasn't even an ending of the fighting or the war, humanitarian ceasefire, which every organization, every aid organization says you cannot provide the needed humanitarian support now, given the devastation, without a ceasefire. And the entire world community supports it, and he goes against it, and he's going to defend the international. So the double standards are, and you saw the clip, which obviously empathizes with the Ukrainians, but obviously have not seen early on anything resembling that from the president or his White House spokesman in terms of empathy with the Palestinians. Now, with regard to Hamas, yes, I mean, we could talk about what the aims of Hamas are. And I think people don't understand. The game, of course, is you could look at Hamas, but Hamas is playing to an audience. So they might have their own aims. There might be extremist aims beyond what might be acceptable as peace, for sure. But they are playing to a Palestinian community. Obviously, before they attack, I mean, the morning before Hamas attacked, it's not like there was peace, justice, and hope in Israel, Palestine, particularly among the Palestinians, whether they're in Gaza or the West Bank. And it was, in fact, utter hopelessness. I was there in Israel and the West Bank just 3 days before the Hamas attack. And there was just utter hopelessness. And I've written, I was not the only one who've written last spring in April saying there's going to be an explosion on a scale we have never seen before. I even used the term, something we had never seen before.
You could feel the hopelessness was going to lead to an earthquake.
Yes. And so yeah, exactly. I mean, the point of it is that it's not what we expected what Hamas exactly was going to do. Of course, we didn't even know it had the capability to do what it did. The Israelis didn't know it had the capability to do what it is. But given what happened, and when you look at the scale of devastation, and the initial Biden administration inclination, I met with members of the administration during that point, was, and now people will just blame Hamas because of the horror that they did, and we galvanize everybody else, majority of Palestinians, majority of the Arabs, all against Hamas. I am sorry, that is such a naive approach. And by the way, I use that term with the administration, naive, to think that when you're just like Israelis witnessing the horror that Hamas committed, and they're going to say, oh, we're going to blame ourselves for it, rather than blame the people who actually doing the shooting. And so, of course, a lot of the sympathy went indirectly to Hamas. And now, of course, when you have hundreds of thousands of new refugees who've lost homes and loved ones and witnessed horror and fear and hunger, are these not going to be recruits? Even if you eliminate Hamas as we have known it, will there not be a replacement for Hamas that comes in? This was predictable. Most of us wrote about it from day one. It's not like this is, we know how wars work. This is not a particularly extraordinary war. It is in terms of the scale right now. We know how human beings operate under such conditions. That's why somebody as seasoned as Biden, it is utterly surprising that he didn't come to grips with this.
I want to get back to this notion of the United States element of complicity in this moment. America has points of influence, of leverage. It's just not using them.
Oh, no doubt, unquestionably. I mean, I think that's a silly movement for anybody who follows this. That's why the rest of the world sort of laughs at this, saying, well, they're judging it not by what we say, but what we do. And we know what we do automatically, no matter what our position is publicly. But the president, as you said, is changing his public discourse a little bit, what people are calling, quote, warning. Obviously, there's a change in the mood. There's a concern. And it's driven by two things. And I got to tell you that, Biden is sensitive to both. I think he miscalculated. He miscalculated the extent to which there would be such pushback against the U.S. It would undermine America's standing as one administration of official thing. We're taking a lot of water on board. But the second thing is his political calculus. His instinct was the more you support Israel, the better politically you are. He has not come to grips with the shifts that have taken place, particularly within the Democratic Party. You could see, in the latest Gallup poll, 2/3 of Democrats disapprove of Israeli military actions in Gaza. The majority of Americans want a ceasefire in Gaza. And he finds himself dropping in the polls. A lot of the drop is coming, the disapproval is coming from his own Democratic constituency in a way that has given his opponent, Donald Trump, an edge. And he's reading the poll. And a lot of people, Democrats in Congress, and many of them I've spoken with, are very concerned about his posture because they could all go down with him. And so now he's not only facing potential consequences for American interests globally, but he's also facing potential electoral consequences for him in 2024.
What do you think the failure to have leverage over Israel in this moment is going to do with the day after equations? Are the Palestinian people going to trust the United States as one of the arbiters, in some form of governance formula in the future? Or have we taken ourselves out of that in their eyes? And what happens with this 75-year containment strategy that has largely been, to hold Palestinians in place? Is that just going to continue to convulse at this point? How do you see the future?
So let me make 2 points on that. Number one, I think it's I don't even talk about the day after. I don't really know, Steve, what the day after is. We're still in today, and today is horrible, and there's no end in sight, and there's a lot of suffering. And really all efforts have to be going into, let's stop this killing. I mean, that is just not something that we should put up with. And I don't know what will be left of Gaza. I mean, just the pictures showing, 50% of the buildings in North Gaza have been destroyed or damaged. You're talking about 80% of Gazans have been rendered homeless. I mean, that's just an astonishing number, even aside from the 70,000 reported dead and wounded already, and more to come. So I think we need to focus on the moment. In many ways, I find the discussion of the day, quote, the day after, is distracting and kind of almost a smokescreen to hide the reality that we now must put all our focus on. But in terms of the trust of the U.S., when there might be a diplomatic opportunity, I agree with you. For one thing, people didn't trust Joe Biden in the Middle East, certainly Palestinians, long before October 7. But now, obviously, completely do not have any faith in him. What does that mean? It means that there is no plan that the United States could put on the table that will be believed or accepted at face value. So the real issue then, when there's an opening for diplomacy, will be, can the United States do something in effect rather than promise something? People want to see action today rather than promise for an action tomorrow, because no one is going to believe the promise. That's where the effort has to go, taking concrete steps that the U.S. can do today and now that can transform the reality in Israel, Palestine. I don't see anything in Joe Biden's resume that says he's capable of doing that.
Is there any scenario where you see these two societies able to reside next to each other without being completely driven by hate on both sides?
You know, I'm a student of war. Of course, wars end, and people do find sometimes a path to reconciliation. During wars, hearts harden. You only focus on what the other side does to you, the horror that you face, the loved ones that you lose, your fear of for your own existence, and you then start demonizing the other. What is the term demonizing? Looking at them as demon and right. Thinking that everything against them works. We know that this is not unusual, but then there are moments where they come together. The question is there a path? Right. We know that there could be. There is no way that we are going to avoid this hatred and cycles of violence on a large scale until there's an equitable outcome for Israelis and Palestinians to live together with equal dignity and self-determination and freedom. You cannot have what now exists, the unjust reality that exists, right. And not expect more and more violence and hate.
Well, we'll leave it there. University of Maryland professor Shibley Telhami, thank you so much for your candor and for being with us today.
My pleasure.
So what's the bottom line? Joe Biden now says Israel will lose international support if it keeps killing innocent people indiscriminately. He and Secretary of State Antony Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan keep saying they're pushing the Israelis to be far more cautious in their campaign that has thus far killed more than 18,000 Palestinians. And yet Biden keeps greenlighting bomb deliveries to Israel. America has leverage in this conflict and could do much to bring it to a ceasefire and work from that moment to try to rebuild some kind of equilibrium between Israelis and Palestinians. But as long as the White House pretends to be pathetically impotent, this carnage is likely to continue, and the risks of escalation remain ever present. That's what failing to use power when you have it looks like. And that's the bottom line.